Well, greetings, everyone. So we're at the midway point in this course. And I hope you'll find us to be interesting tonight. So we pick up with 48 Doughty Street. Dickens moved his family in here under a lease. He's still leasing from March of 37 to December of 39. It's a row home. He lived in this section here, where my cursor is squiggling. And it is now the home of the Charles Dickens Museum, which is a phenomenal museum.
Yeah.
Holds a significant, small but significant collection of key items in his life and career. And they have since purchased this building here. So actually the museum is two homes in one, but the one home recreates where he lived. It was a home fit for an author on the move. It was well furnished. He had it repainted. His wife had all new curtains and furnishings and all put in. You get an idea of that from the dining room here. And on the right, of course, is his study. This is the actual desk where he wrote all of Oliver Twist, as well as most of Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby, and he started on Barnaby Rudge before moving again. He's going to move around a bunch of times, but a lot of it he's going to be, for the next couple of years after he leaves Doughty Street, he'll be staying in Italy. He'll be going to the United States. He'll be back in Europe, and then he rents a couple places. He'll finally build his first home, but that's past our time frame. Pickwick Papers, I mean, I've talked a lot about sketches by Boz. I think most people have no clue about the sketches, but they're important to understanding Dickens and London, and are a real window into the world he was seeing and growing up in. But Pickwick Papers is where it really all starts. He was not the first choice, but after another person declined the offer, Dickens was offered the job and he took it to write in support of illustrations of this fictitious, sporting club. Sporting clubs were all the rage, and they would travel around England at this time and do all kinds of things, including some hunting. So he wasn't, I mean, he, as the writer, it's the illustrator who was primary in this piece, but it quickly turns itself around when they realize what they've got in Dickens, and all of a sudden he's kind of running the show in Pickwick Papers, and it really catapults him into fame very quickly. And he got real lucky in the fourth issue, fourth monthly. He creates Sam Weller, who was a Cockney bootblack, and he becomes the sidekick of Samuel Pickwick, excuse me. And it's a hilarious relationship. Weller is probably one of the 3 or 4 most famous, most popular characters of all of Dickens's approximately 2,000 characters that he creates in his career. He's well known and he is funny. Simon Callow, a very famous actor and director, who's written, he's a Dickensian. He's written 2 books on Dickens, and I love this quote in describing Pickwick Papers at the bottom: "A great hokey cokey of eccentrics, con men, phony politicians, amorous widows, and wily witty servants, somehow catching an essence of what it is to be English, celebrating companionship, generosity, good nature, in the figure of Samuel Pickwick, Esquire, one of the great embodiments in literature of benevolence."
Nice.
While he's finishing up Pickwick Papers, he begins Oliver Twist. So Dickens is writing most often two things at once, at least. Plus, he's an editor, remember. So he's having to read all of the material, and whether he accepts or rejects that's coming into Bentley Monthly, and some other side projects that he had. How he had time to do everything that he did do is hard to understand. While he's finished Pickwick and he's finishing up Oliver Twist, he starts Nicholas Nickleby, which is another famous novel. And since the 18th century, parents had been sending their children to notoriously brutal Yorkshire boarding schools. Parents who had unwanted children would send them there, well, boys only, would send them there to be forgotten. And Dickens finds out about this, and he uses Nicholas Nickleby in part to expose to all of England what's going on in Yorkshire. And another one of his crusty personalities that he creates is Wackford Squeers, who runs the school, the fictitious school in Nicholas Nickleby. It's a wonderful character. He's a horrible man, and very memorable in some of the actors who have portrayed him. And as always in the formula with Dickens, he has a poor soul, a poor student who is not doing well. He's actually not even a student. He's helping out at the school, and he's being beaten, and he will die tragically, which also seems to be a requirement in many of Dickens's novels. And then after he's finished Twist and working primarily on Nicholas Nickleby, he'll start Barnaby Rudge. This was his first of two historical novels. It talks about it treats the Gordon riots of 1780, which was a Protestant Catholic dispute, which was still raging in the late 18th century in England. And this point is disputed among scholars. There's preeminent scholars on both sides of this argument. Some reject it, some will accept the idea that actually what Dickens was doing here with the Gordon riots was to attack the Chartists, who we talked about, and their protests. It's a split decision. Needless to say, before Twist is even completed, Dickens is raking in rave reviews. So here's just a taste of one from the London and Westminster Review. The qualities for which everybody reads and admires him are his humor and wit, and it is well known that he has delighted to employ these powers mostly in describing and commenting on the comic peculiarities of the lower orders of Englishmen. Indeed, the class which has been the peculiar object of this attention is even more limited. It is easy to see that his observations have been mainly confined to London, that he has minutely observed and most felicitously caught the peculiarities of every class in this great city and its suburbs, from the tradesman down to the cabman or the cad, that he is intimately acquainted with all those classes whom a resident in London gets acquainted with. As I've alluded to before, Dickens is not only a writer, he's an astute businessman. And he helps put together a publishing scheme that is going to help him to rake in a lot of money. So we know that Twist was first published in Bentley's Monthly. And then what he does, and this is the standard operation, no one, very few people could afford bound volumes. And most novels were broken up into 3-volume sets. And so in 1838, a year after Twist is complete in Bentley's, he's published, Dickens, as well as support from Bentley, are publishing a 3-volume hardbound set that would only be afforded by the upper classes. And then he's going to go back a year later in 1839, and he's going to republish in monthly numbers Oliver Twist again. And because Twist has become so renowned, he's going to sell a lot more volumes or monthlies the second time around, 2 years after Twist is complete, and 1 year after that. And then in 1846, he's going to, the publishing, I'm digressing a second here. The publishing companies and technology are rapidly changing for the better, faster and cheaper. So by the mid 1840s, they could actually produce this single volume of Oliver Twist for less money than these guys. Now, it was a cheaper binding and all that, but still, more people by mid 40s could purchase books than ever before. So he's had 4 ventures of publishing Oliver Twist by 1846. And by 1846, he's a very wealthy man by 1846. So in less than 10 years, he has risen up the ranks into the upper middle class. He has some help. John Forster is arguably the single most important figure in Dickens's life, period, more than his wife or anyone else. They befriend as Dickens is finishing up Pickwick Papers, and Forster stays with Dickens from that point on till Dickens's death. And other than the Twist, he will read every one of Dickens's manuscripts first before anyone else. He's a writer, he's a critic, he's a lawyer, although he didn't practice, and a successful author. And he also has an understanding of business to a better degree than Dickens does. And he's going to get Dickens out of all kinds of trouble. Dickens has a temper, and he gets frustrated with publishers who get in his way, and Dickens believes is costing him money. And so Forster's essentially going to be his front man, business-wise, for the rest of Dickens's career. And they will meet multiple days weekly for the rest of their lives. And Forster will get the first crack at writing Dickens' biography. And he has availed information that no one else knew. Now, they were good friends, so Forster's biography has to be, questioned, and certainly scholars these days are digging through and finding the inconsistencies or things that are maybe been embellished too far, but it's still an important source because he does reveal things that no one had any idea about Dickens's life. Copyright. It's a big part of Dickens's concerns. All control over publications was initially in the hands of booksellers and publishers, and they are always in Dickens's way early in his career, certainly through until we get to about David Copperfield, which is past our time. Richard Bentley, who he works for, he is the editor of Bentley's Miscellany. Dickens had a bad relationship with him, and they are going to have all kinds of arguments. And again, Forster will be in the middle of that. Publishers could also produce cheap editions of an author's work without the author having any control over it and getting not a penny or a shilling. And what particularly frustrated Dickens, as well, maybe not as much as that, but because it didn't cost them money, but theaters would pick up Oliver Twist and produce a play before they even knew how Dickens was going to complete the novel and make things up. And most of these were atrociously produced and written and acted, but they made money on the theater scene in London. Successful authors lost considerable financial potential because there was no international copyright agreements. Philadelphia publishers were quick to produce a Dickens novel, never paying him a cent. They would have to wait till the ships arrived with the latest edition of a Bentley Monthly, or later on, the 3 volumes, and then they would mass produce it, and not a penny would go to Dickens. Nicholas Nickleby, chapter 48, kind of reveals how he feels. Quote, "You take the uncompleted books of living authors, fresh from their hands, wet from the press, cut, hack, and carve them. All this without permission and against his will. And then, to crown the whole proceeding, publish in some mean pamphlet an unmeaning farrago of garbled extracts from his work, to which your name as author, with the honorable distinction annexed of having perpetrated 100 other outrages of the same description. Now show me the distinction between such pilfering as this and picking a man's pocket in the street." So he was working under the copyright law of 1842, which is not going to be updated until the 50s. And these are just 2 examples of theater broadsides promoting Oliver Twist. He would actually attend some of these, and then he would write about them in Bentley's Monthly and just shred them. And I think what's interesting here to note is the Philadelphia firm of Carey, Leah, and Blanchard offered Dickens as a goodwill gesture £25 for the first 12 parts of Pickwick, which they had already published. Dickens declined the offer. An important thing about Dickens's process of writing, he took night walks, which he becomes famous for, maybe even infamous. Writing to his friend John Forster in 1850. I mean, these guys saw each other, again, 3 or 4 days most weeks, but they wrote letters back and forth as well. Dickens confessed that, quote, "If I couldn't walk fast and far, I should just explode and perish." Dickens found long walks in its cities, not just London, to be places not of lights and pleasure, but of guilt and darkness, his words. Dickens remained a dizzying, energetic pedestrian throughout his career, finding those 20-mile walks, and he averaged 20 miles a night. Think about that. He usually completed his walk about dawn at night to be both inspirational and therapeutic. He writes this, which of course is autobiographical. So much of Dickens's writing is autobiographical from sketches. "But the streets of London, to be beheld in the very height of their glory, should be seen on a dark, dull, murky winter's night, when there is just enough damp gently stealing down to make the pavement greasy without cleansing it of any of its impurities, and when the heavy, lazy mist, which hangs over every object, makes the gas lamps look brighter and the brilliantly lighted shops more splendid from the contrast they present to the darkness around." He would see on his walks, he would see his characters, and then he would go home and he would write down, he didn't take any notes with him, and he would write down everything that he saw. And that's how, once he's into heavy novel writing, he gets his characters in many, many ways. So now we get to our topic of Oliver Twist tonight, and it's crime, Victorian crime. From Twist, chapter 47. "It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down." Justice in Victorian England was essentially based on the acts of Parliament. Parliament would pass laws, and they would be then turned into that was the only codifying of laws there were at that time, whatever Parliament decided to deal with or not deal with. And of course, we've read about the beadle, and your beadle, and there's many of them across Great Britain, are your local policemen who covered domestic and religious situations. In addition to the beadle, one level up, you had constables and watchmen. And again, there were constables and watchmen in every town, major town, and the cities, obviously. And that's the way justice was pretty much meted out at the local level. And if we skip to the last bullet point, though in the midst of that, things could reach one of three levels of courts, and those courts, these three levels of courts would remain unchanged. The family division at the bottom, the chancery court, which was financial, and then the Queen's Bench if it was a capital crime. Things change in 1829. The Metropolitan Police Act, passed by Parliament, will establish the first police force in London, nowhere else. And then in Parliament will broaden that in 1835 with the passage of the Municipal Corporation Act in an attempt to unify the justice system with enforcement. This required police forces to be established in all major cities and large towns. And then above the police, you have the magistrates, who were chosen because people knew who they were, they bought their place. In some cases, it was very political. And of course, we know about the magistrate in Oliver Twist. Oh, and to the right, one of the Twist illustrations, the Bow Street Runners. This illustrates what it was like before the Municipal Corporations Act actually took hold in a small town. The Bow Street Runners was just an informal private police force. And some towns would have these, and they would run around and of course, in the novel, cause havoc and aren't very good. And Dickens is lampooning them. So Robert Peel is the force behind some of the change and reforms that are going to take place as Dickens is starting out. He's a conservative. He's not a liberal by any means. And he believed, as we have talked about, the mainstream conservative thinking. They're reformers in the sense that they want equal justice, but they certainly do not embrace any kind of democracy. So he'll be behind the passage of the Metropolitan Police Force, and he will help to reform working conditions, not because of any strong feeling towards the suffering workers, but the belief that if you take care of the workers, then the factory is going to be more productive. So a little bit different thinking. So the Metropolitan Police Force, they were nicknamed the Peelers, Robert Peel, and Bobbies. And of course, Bobbies has stuck, although I don't know if they still use that term or if it's just something that's been around since the 60s and 70s. These are photographs of the time. And this is their uniform. And in a later novel, Dickens will write, "There are people who have no human heart and who must be crushed like savage beasts and cleared out of the way." He wasn't always a fan of the police force. And he wrote this in 1835. No. He wrote this in 1835 in one of his sketches. It's called The Prison Van. "After jerking the miserable girl down with a force which made her stagger on the pavement, she got into the vehicle and was followed by her wretched companion. These two girls had been thrown upon London streets, their vices and debauchery by a sordid and rapacious mother. What the younger girl was then, the elder had been once, and what the elder then was, the younger must soon become. A melancholy prospect, but how surely to be realized. A tragic drama, but how often acted. Turn to the prisons and the police offices of London. Nay, look into the very streets themselves. These things pass before our eyes, day after day and hour after hour. They have become such matters of course that they are utterly disregarded. The progress of these girls in crime will be as rapid as the flight of a pestilence, resembling it too in its baneful influence and widespreading infection. Step by step, how many wretched females within the sphere of every man's observation have become involved in a career of vice, frightful to contemplate, hopeless at its commencement, loathsome and repulsive in its course, friendless, forlorn, and unpitied at its miserable conclusion. Here's a contemporary cartoon, broadside cartoon. They weren't appearing in newspapers yet. And people would buy these, and usually shopkeepers, and then hang them up in their windows for people to see. And this is absolutely an attack on the police force, as questioning their abilities and all that. They were nicknamed the Blue Devils because their uniforms were blue. Mr. Fang, one of the magistrates, well, the magistrate in Oliver Twist. The quote at the bottom: "If the law supposes that," said Mr. Bumble, squeezing his hat emphatically in both hands, "the law is an ass, an idiot. If that's the eye of the law is a bachelor. And the worst I wish the law is, that his eye may be opened by experience, So even Bumble could turn against the judicial system when it was convenient to his position, which in this case was feeling for Oliver Twist's dilemma. Dickens was a lifelong critic of the iniquities of social system that produced criminals and then punished them. It was nicknamed the Bloody Code. There were over, at the time Dickens is writing Twist, there's over 200 crimes that were capital offenses, meaning they would be executed. Conviction and penalty most often was like a lottery, dependent upon what police magistrate you faced. Dickens had heard about the man Alan Stewart Lang, second to last bullet, and he was infamous for being a horrible human being, callous, sending people, particularly young people, to be sent off to Australia or worse, into a hardcore prison for the smallest offenses. So he creates Mr. Fang, and again, the name kind of tells you something, to represent Lang. Lang would be fired 2 years after Oliver Twist was published. Not directly because of Oliver Twist, but he kept overstepping his boundaries. And criminal prisons were generally in a shocking state. Again, from sketches. This is arguably one of his most famous pieces, Dickens. This is called A Visit to Newgate. If you remember, Newgate's a prison. And it's modeled after Marshalsea Prison, which Dickens saw firsthand as a 12-year-old when he was visiting his family in debtor prison at the Marshalsea. The girl belonged to a class, unhappily but too extensive, the very existence of which should make men's hearts bleed. Barely past her childhood, it required but a glance to discover that she was one of those children, born and bred in neglect, vice, who have never known what childhood is, who have never been taught to love and court a parent's smile or to dread a parent's frown. The thousand nameless endearments of childhood, its gaiety and its innocence, are alike unknown to them. They have entered at once upon the stern realities and miseries of life, and to their better nature it is almost hopeless, to appeal in after times by any of the references which will awaken, if it be only for a moment, some good feeling in ordinary bosoms, however corrupt they may have become. Talk to them of parental solicitude, the happy days of childhood, and the merry games of infancy. Tell them of hunger and the streets, beggary and stripes, the gin shop, the station house, and the pawnbrokers, and they will understand you. Of course, you have the famous scene in Oliver Twist of the attempt to pickpocket Mr. Brownlow, which is what gets Twist into trouble with the magistrate to begin with. The literary tradition in which Dickens chose to write was rich in violence, villainy, and mystery. Crime was an inescapable social problem. Dickens displays a passion for dramatizing and commenting upon these topical issues in multiple novels. Especially in his early years as an author, crime was formidably common and unchecked. There's a reference in Twist to the hue and cry. The quote at the bottom, chapter 12, mentions the hue and cry. And this actually dates back to the 13th century and was still on the books when Dickens is writing Twist. And by that statute, if an event like the pocket picking of Brownlow occurs and someone sees it, all they have to do is yell out, and then the public is expected to chase after the perpetrator, which is exactly what happens, of course, with Oliver. Crime is a bestseller in Victorian England. Public hangings were so popular, if you wanted a good seat, you had to buy tickets to go see a hanging. And the penny press is out now, and so you could buy a weekly for literally a penny, a 16-page piece of lurid tales of murder and all kinds of nasty stuff. And then ultimately these will turn into novels. This becomes known as the Newgate novel phenomenon. One of the most infamous crimes of the period was one Julia Martha Thomas, who was murdered by her maid Kate Webster on the left, a 30-year-old Irish woman with a history of theft. Webster disposed of the body by dismembering it, boiling the flesh off the bones, and throwing most of the remains into the Thames River. That isn't the actual boiling pot, but that's the typical pot that most middle-class homes had, where they would boil their laundry or their Christmas pudding. Of course, the criminal underworld is all about Oliver Twist. On the left, a place where Dickens would have walked through was known as Jacob's Island, very notorious place, a rookery as they were called. And that is a photograph of the times. Crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims. Twist, chapter 30. Of course, the Artful Dodger, a popular figure in the novel, sometimes sympathized with and other times seen as a hardened criminal who would turn into a Fagin type as he got older. A friend's just an enemy in disguise. You can't trust nobody. But of course, the main feature of the crime side of Dickens's Newgate novel, and it is a Newgate novel, even though he fought hard to convince people that it wasn't. It was just better written than most. Is all about when Bill murders Nancy. It was a ghastly figure to look upon. The murderer staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Now, the novels, the Twist novel that you've read does not, if you're reading with the original illustrations, it does not include the illustration on the right. Cruikshank refused to include an illustration that would show the murder. He said it was in bad taste. He wouldn't lower himself to do so because that was like a Newgate novel. So there is no illustration of the murder in the first several editions of Twist. This particular illustration emerges in the 1880s, but it's a pretty effective dramatic illustration. All through the novel, if you've read it, hangings, hangings, hangings. Lots of mentions of hangings, the gallows. Of course, in his own way, Bill Sikes will send himself to the gallows. And for me, the most powerful and best illustration of Twist, my favorite, is Fagin sitting in the cell waiting his fate. What a fine thing capital punishment is. Dead men never repent. Dead men never bring awkward stories to light. Fagin says this early in the novel, and of course, in the end, it becomes true for him too. Here's the actual Newgate execution bell on the left. It was rung outside the condemned prisoner's cell at midnight on the eve of an execution. So what do we know? Dickens' notoriety, fame, and wealth evolved quickly due in part to the publication of his sketches in the Pickwick Papers. He was instrumental in helping to shape the publication trade with the implementation of serialization, as well as in his fight to strengthen copyright law. John Forster emerged early on to become Dickens's closest confidant, playing a major role in negotiating the author's contracts for editing, publishing, and legal concerns. Dickens' lengthy night walks, due in part to his restless spirit and insomnia, proved vital in observing and learning about the minutest details of his beloved London. And finally, crime was a popular reading topic throughout Great Britain, and Dickens capitalized on the public's voracious taste for Gothic, macabre, mayhem, murder, and criminals. And clearly, he was influenced and took advantage of the Newgate phenomenon, even though he tried to deny it. So that is tonight's lesson. I just want to throw in a promo here. In case you haven't seen this yet, David Lean, in my opinion, produces the best Oliver Twist. No offense to you Disney fans. It was produced, printed in 1948. It was banned in the United States until 1951 or two, somewhere around there. We'll get into why it was banned for a short while in another lesson. But this is a powerful, dramatic presentation, and I think it is brilliantly done. And you can see it for free on YouTube, the whole thing. Or you can rent it on Amazon Prime. And with that, Doc, I'm sorry I've taken more time than I should have. I turn it over to you.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Thanks, Kendall. Hey, everybody. So the poem that I've shared with you this week isn't really, a good poem at all. It's a murder ballad. They were very, very popular, and in fact, they, they have many of the characteristics of the Newgate novel. And I think one thing we'll see by going through this poem, and it's not a poem that demands a lot of close analysis, it's a ballad, is how much better Dickens does crime than the authors of these ballads, which were very popular and either spoken or sung on the street. So tonight, I set this particular ballad to music, and so we're gonna sing it. Now, I can't really hear whether you're singing or not. I, of course, will offer my rendition. It's in ballad, the whole thing. When I was at GA early on, I don't know how the hell this happened, but it occurred to me that certain poems were written in ballad stanza. Emily Dickinson's, for example, big time. And then I realized, wait a minute, I could use songs in teaching her poetry. So I would be teaching Emily Dickinson's poetry to the tune of Amazing Grace, The Yellow Rose of Texas, and other pieces. Now, my colleagues in the English department said that I had pretty much ruined Emily Dickinson for them and for the students. I demurred and said that, it's simply a way of teaching the poem. So anyway, get ready to sing, because this is sort of interactive, right? Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of the tune. So it's loosely based on the band's Long Black Veil, but then it goes to hell after a while. Okay. It's enough to get the idea. You'll get it after the first, the first verse. A barbarous, foul, and horrid deed I shortly shall recite, which did occur in Portsmouth town upon the Saturday night.
We send all this stuff.
An aged man of 80 years, his housekeeper likewise, were there most basely murdered by a monster in the sky. All in the night, so
dark and drear, his entrance he obtained, and with a deadly hammer he beat out the old man's brains. His throat is cut from ear to ear,
most horrible
to view. The streams of crimson blood did flow, the bedroom through and through. The housekeeper likewise lay butchered on the floor. Her face and hands was cruelly were cut and stabbed full sore.
Her head was nearly severed from her body, quite
white. Those who beheld shivered, so dreadful was the sight.
When at
the bar the killer stood, could not deny his guilt. 'Twas clearly proved that he, the aged couple's blood had split.
The jury found him guilty. The judge
to him did say, "You must prepare to end your life upon a hanging day." Bravo, Doc, bravo.
Thank you. So, what do you see in the poem that you might say would be sensationalistic, the kind of things that the audiences would eat up, like white on rice?
I would think beating out the old man's brain and slitting his throat from ear to ear.
Absolutely, Jenny. Yeah.
Crimson blood flowing, all those good gory details.
Yeah.
Covered head, etc.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes, I mean, the second and third verses are the, contain the, the most gruesome details, the cut from ear to ear, the butchery of the housekeeper, cut and stab. And then, of course, the author of this refrains from having the head severed, but it was nearly severed. Okay. And of course, it created everybody who saw it just shivered. So this is pretty much taking advantage of the attitudes towards readers who enjoyed reading about crime. right? Okay, so I thought what we could do is would be to take a look at, you know, 4 of the main criminals: Dickens, Fagin, Sykes, Dodger, Fagin, Sykes, and Nancy. And maybe a good place to start would be wherever they're together, because I think there's a kind of interesting dynamic in the way that we evaluate each of these characters as criminals. But before that, I wanted to ask a general question, and this kind of covers a lot of the study questions that I sent you guys, and that is, how serious are we to take crime in the novel? That is, crime other than Bill's murder of Nancy. So you don't have to answer that right now, but keep that in mind with the way we see the criminals, the way we're introduced to them, the way we see them interact. Okay. So are there any scenes that you'd like to take us through or take us to that we could take a look at that includes more than one of the criminals and kind of shows their differing characteristics and Dickens' commentary on those characteristics? So just shoot out an answer when you're ready. I've got stuff if you want to talk.
I particularly like the introduction of Sykes at the beginning of chapter 13. In my edition, it's page 94, bottom of page 94, chapter 13.
Book the first, yeah.
He says it's the initial description of Sykes.
Okay, it's 98 in the Penguin.
Okay.
Are you talking about the man who growled?
Yes, the
Okay.
man who growled out those words. And then a little bit later in that paragraph, he had a brown hat on his head and a dirty Belcher handkerchief round his neck, with the long frayed ends of which he smeared the beer from his face as he spoke, disclosing when he had done so a broad, heavy countenance with a beard of 3 days' growth and 2 scowling eyes, one of which displayed various party-colored symptoms of having been recently damaged by a blow. Then I think he's much better on describing people like Sykes, much more authentic and convincing than when he's manipulating our feelings about Oliver's friend Dick earlier in the novel, and then he starts in at Fagin a few lines later, and starts to abuse Fagin, and that's also where the poor dog is introduced as well. So I think he's just very.
I love dogs. And why is Bullseye here? By the way, when I directed Oliver at GA in 1983, I think it was, we had a bulldog. One of the actors had this, really lovely bulldog. I mean, there was nothing that approached Sykes's dog. I mean, like the red eyes and the white. It was just a cute little bulldog that, frankly, we were just, concerned that it wouldn't poop on the stage. But anyway, why do you think he has? Because that dog gets a lot of attention, even at the end of the novel. Why?
To appeal to our sympathy. because he abuses the dog, and he's physically harsh and mean spirited towards the dog, and the dog elicits our sympathy.
Yeah, that's right on, Richard. And, you know, when you look at these 2 pages on 98 and 99, it's going to be pretty hard for Bill to be anything but maybe the worst of the lot, of the criminal lot. I mean, he's a bad guy. We know that, right? And the physical description says it, his treatment of the dog, you know, says it. And the more we go on into the novel, there's evidence upon evidence upon evidence that Dickens hates this guy. And that he's
I also
like,
think that,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I also think the dog is very similar to the children that work for Fagin. It's sort of the same relationship, that love-hate. You know, they work for him and they like him, and they depend on him for food and support, just like the dog is depending on Sykes. And so they sort of stick with them, but they know they're going to get beaten, just like when they talk about, you know, Artful Dodger and Charlie coming back sometimes and being thrown down the stairs when they didn't come back with enough stuff, and being treated poorly. The dog was the same way. And of course, at the end, when they're chasing him, he wants to kill the dog, you know, but the dog's sort of smart enough to back off at that point. But at the end, you know, the dog leaps right on him, you know, when he's swinging, and then gets, you know, killed at the end. But the dog, I feel like the dog's a parallel to the children in the story. The dog is to Sykes what the children are to Fagin. They're all being used for what they're good for.
And, you know, in a weird sense, it just occurred to me when you were talking about how the dog jumps on Sykes at the end, you could even compare him to Nancy. Right. Nancy's, total dependence on Sykes, even though she becomes a good person with a conscience, right? She still depends on him. She's still so dependent on him. Yeah, excellent. Okay, good. How about another scene that illustrates this gang of criminals?
This is Sarah.
And shows differences. Hey, Sarah.
Hey. I'm looking at page 130.
Excellent.
Thereabouts, when Nancy actually speaks up in all.
Okay. Okay. Go for it.
Oh, that's all I got. Hang on. I think I heard this part on the audiobook. I just remember that I read it late last night. So, I mean, she really says more than she has in the entire book at this point.
Absolutely.
And
at this point, what has happened?
Okay, so, well, she actually is complicit in bringing him back,
right?
Stealing Oliver back from Mr. Brownlow's when he was trying to do good and return the books to the bookseller and the money that was owed. So, let's see, what did they do to Oliver that she turns?
The dog was going to get him. The dog was about to attack him.
Yeah, like Oliver had looked from one to the other while these words were being spoken about a quarter of the way down the page, as if he were bewildered and could scarcely understand what passed. But when Bill Sykes concluded, he jumped up suddenly to his feet, tore wildly from the room, uttering shrieks for help that made the bare old house echo to the roof. And so right away, she's saying, "Keep back the dog, Bill." Right? But then says, "Serve him right. Stand off from me or I'll split your skull against the wall." He's saying this to Nancy. "I don't care for that, Bill. I don't care for that. The child shan't be torn down by the dog unless you kill me first." Yeah. This is talk about defining moments. This is like a major defining moment for Nancy. She not only stands up to Bill, but she is doing it to protect Oliver. And then she stands right up to Fagin on 131, middle of the page. "I won't stand by and see it done, Fagin. You've got the boy, and what more would you have? Let him be. Let him be, or I shall put that mask on some of you that will bring me to the gallows before my time." Yeah, that's well done, Sarah. That's an excellent example. And again, her in contrast with the other criminals. What do we make of Dodger? He's introduced on page 60. And again, I'm interested in seeing what you think of the different ways that Dickens introduces and develops the criminal characters, because they're not really. I mean, they have elements of this type, but they're more than that. They're, to me. So Dodger on page 60. Look, I'm going to read this initial description to him, of him, and see what words you see you think stand out, or points that Dickens is trying to make about, hey, this kid is not really like most kids. The boy who addressed this inquiry to the young wayfarer was about his own age, but one of the queerest looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see. But he had got about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short, of his age, with rather bow legs, and little sharp, ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head so slightly that it threatened to fall off every moment. Then at the end, he was altogether as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 3 feet 6, or something less, in his bluchers. So what did you notice there in that description? How does Dickens use his description to characterize the kid that we're going to see develop in the novel?
I think this is a child who's been robbed of his childhood, because he's dressed like a man. He's a recruiter. I mean, that's his job, is to find other children to work for Fagin. And that's just what I took from it.
Excellent. That's excellent. By the way, I have been remiss in giving table slaps today. So you get one, but there are retroactive table slaps that several of you should have gotten, and I apologize for that. I think the singing overwhelmed me. But anyway, yeah, that's good. What else do you see in that description on 60?
Once again, he's always bringing up how dirty, like everything that has to do with criminals is dirty. This kid is so dirty, and where Fagin lives is so dirty. He really makes mention of that. And in the flat brow, sort of like the Cro-Magnon thing of like these criminals are really don't look like refined, like you would get a description of some of the other people in it.
Okay. Now, what do you make of these descriptions? The airs and manners of a man. The airs and manner of a man. With that, the Cro-Magnon face, the flat-browed, snub-nosed, he's 3 feet 6 inches. He's a little guy with this big overcoat on. This huge overcoat. And, he's shuffling around there. He's kind of, everything about him is pretty much atypical. He's on the outside, isn't he? He's on the outside of the other characters that we meet, except for those who are also criminals. But he's residing on the outside, whether it's his height, his acting like an adult, his dirtiness. He's not like the others. So he is an other. And I think, Jennifer, you said something that was the idea is that this is his life. This is his life. And we find out later that Nancy, you know, if you put the years together, she must have come under Fagin's influence when she was like 5 or 6, and she's now probably 17. Well, her youth, her childhood was taken from her too. And I think that's you know, we don't really know anything about Bill regarding that. We hate him. That's, you know, it's a good thing to do, just to hate Bill. And Fagin, you know, Fagin's too old, you know, but to go back to his sources. But that's, you know, and then how does Dodger interact later on? How do we see him become, you know, is he a pretty good pal of Oliver's?
Not really. I mean, the minute he gets caught pickpocketing, he turns around and yells, "Stop thief," and runs after him. Like, oops, don't pick on me. Let's go get that kid. He did it.
Okay.
You know, he's pretty much a spy and a rat. He just, you know, does whatever it takes for him to survive. I don't think he's a big pal of Oliver's.
Okay. Other ideas about him and Oliver?
He's very street smart.
Yes.
He's roistering and swaggering. He's very cocky.
There's a comment by Fagin. He says, "It's your living." He's saying it to Nancy, but it's your living. And so I think that Dodger does it well.
Yeah. Is he with that now? Where is he on a scale? If we're looking at the four biggies of Nancy, Fagin, Bill, and Dodger, where would you place him in terms of badness as a criminal?
I put him just above. It would be Sykes, then Fagin, then Dodger, then Nancy.
Okay.
At least Nancy's trying to do something redeeming. He's a kid and he's, you know, just doing what he's been taught. And you'd put Sykes, for me, of course, you put Sykes at the top because he committed murder, which is, you know, Fagin's offense. He's not a murderer.
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. I mean, I think that, and then, you know, one of the group scenes is, you know, the dancing, the dance that goes on. Let's see, where is that? That's, you know what I'm talking about. I have it here. Page
See when
7.
they teach him to pickpocket and he thinks
Yeah,
that
page
they make
70.
handkerchiefs. I
What's
mean,
that?
I love that Oliver thinks that they manufacture handkerchiefs. He's so
Yeah.
innocent
I know.
that even though he's had this terrible upbringing, he was rather sheltered. He lived in the country. He didn't know about this underbelly that he's now,
Excellent.
part
Yeah.
of.
Excellent. Yeah. So that he thinks it's kind of a cool game, doesn't he?
I think at the end, when Fagin wakes him up to tell Sykes what he's witnessed and heard on the bridge, is a bit of a Nancy moment of kind of coming to terms and maybe showing some conscience, because he doesn't really implicate doesn't really say what he's heard. Fagin sort of does the talking for him, and that's what's written in the novel. To a degree, you almost think as a reader, when you're reading that, if Dodger really had his way, he might not give him all that information. But Fagin knows exactly how to play Sykes and is doing so at that moment.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And here's a question too. What happens to Dodger? I mean, I realize I'm breaking my promise that I wasn't going to go past page 213, but
he gets transported, right?
He what?
He gets transported.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't he go to Australia?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
However, but he goes off, yelling at the judge and making a fool of himself, which everyone seems to think is great.
But
he goes down swinging. It's great. He's yelling and talking about, dare they do this?
so, when you compare him to the other criminal characters, Dickens has been kind. I mean, no, it's not great to being sent to Australia, but Bill's dead, Fagin's dead, Nancy's dead, Dodger lives. Dodger lives to continue his life. So, I agree that there are these signs with him of him that since his childhood was stolen, yeah, he's well prepped to be a criminal, but you could never see Dodger like Sykes. He could never be a Sykes. And I think Dickens wants us to see that. In other words, I think Dickens wants us to see some gradation in the criminal of his day. And here's something that I was thinking about. Do you ever really worry? I mean, I'm implying my opinion, but I'll rephrase it. How much do you worry about Oliver's future in the novel? I mean, he gets kidnapped. It's a real mess. The kid is in, he gets, he's part of a burglary attempt. But how seriously does Dickens want us to take that?
There's
Okay,
the
this has to be
last
your
paragraph.
question.
Last paragraph of chapter 19
Yes.
says, he looked like death, not death as shown in the shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed. So at that moment in the book, you think he's a goner in many ways.
Okay.
He also
Other-
leans into the serial nature a bit. There's a
Yeah.
lot of, will Oliver survive? Tune in next month.
Is there anything that,
Or next
like,
series.
I mean, I read the book first when I was like 13. I was like total dork. I read it on my own. It wasn't even a son. Okay. And that's how one becomes a dorky English teacher. So I never worried about it. I always figured, yeah, this'll work out. And I was thinking about that today. Well, what is it then that makes me feel positive about him? Nancy, I can get being killed, but Oliver had to survive.
But
Now,
it's because
is that just me, or what is Dickens doing to make me feel positive?
because he ends up almost immediately as soon as he's caught picking pockets, he ends up safely with Mr. Brownlow. So Dickens is always ready to just bail him out. So you sort of know right away that it's all going to work out okay in the end. I mean, he's only with Mr. Brownlow briefly, and then he's back in trouble. But you know that he'll be bailed out once more.
I was thinking that he has a positive nature because when he ends up with the Mayleys and he's gathering flowers every day, and going out and taking in the countryside and all that stuff, he's relentlessly positive. He has resiliency. And I think I read Oliver in these books early before I knew of like post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. Like you'd think he'd be a good candidate for therapy the rest of his life. But
oh my God,
like in Dickens, he picks some flowers and he gets with nice people and you know what? Life is good. I can get past this.
Yeah. I think also for me, it's the humor.
Yes.
Like, you're in the courtroom with Fang, or in the police station. He's just such a jerk. You laugh at him. You laugh at the guy Duff and what's his name? Duff and
Blathers
Blathers
and Duff.
So you're laughing at all of this, and I think that there is part, that sometimes Dickens's humor, takes away from the seriousness of Oliver's plight. I know that I must shut up now because Kendall has given me the word.
Fox, that was an excellent point to end on. And I'm the one again who needs to apologize because I ran over. I assure the audience, who probably came to see you more than me anyway.
Oh, tut tut, pshaw.
That the next 3 will involve him more than me. And the number 6 will be an extravaganza of Doc Giuliani.
Well, I just want everybody to sort of, bone up on the Oliver soundtrack.
Oh, God.
Because that will be part, and Ginny, especially you.
Memorize now. I can start on any song at any moment if you'd like.
Well,
one of our other former students who had to leave because she had her baby who was giving her grief, she actually performed in Oliver as well at GA Day Camp. So we got a couple ringers. So, but we have to let Heather go. I mean, she's had a long day, and then we stick her on this. But it's been a delightful conversation. As always, I appreciate all of you who wanted to come and put up with me and listen to Doc. So thank you very much.
Put up with me too.
Next week, just a little hint, we'll be talking about women. So thank you very much, one and all, and good night.